Hitler's army was still fighting, but no longer for victory. Every order was fulfilled out of duty, not hope. The lines were narrowing, the fronts were collapsing, and discipline was the only thing that kept an exhausted force standing. The command continued to demand absolute resistance. The reports spoke of regroupings, of counterattacks that never occurred. In practice, each decision was made too late and died before being executed. The units dwindled, resources disappeared, and the language of power continued to repeat empty slogans. In those final days, the army still existed, but only as a reflection of what it had been, a structure that obeyed even when it no longer made sense. As the Reich collapsed, its commands continued to believe that willpower could replace reality. It was then that the true collapse began. On the 1st of January 1945, the Eastern Front of the Third Reich showed a situation that the High Command's own reports defined with an unequivocal expression. The collapse was imminent. Between the Vistula and the Oder, the Red Army concentrated more than 2 million men against exhausted German forces, with divisions reduced to a fraction of their theoretical strength. The reports from the OKH revealed a scenario that the Führer's directives refused to admit. Reserves, fuel, and coordination among commands were lacking. The structure of the front, once extensive and articulated, was disintegrating under Soviet pressure. Army Group A, under the nominal command of General Joseph Haag, was barely holding positions in the Warsaw sector. The divisions were incomplete, supported by contingents of Volkssturm and remnants of units withdrawn from the Balkans. In the north, Army Group Center, led by Georg Hans Reinhardt, was defending East Prussia with increasingly scarce means. The logistics records of the early days of January documented a dramatic drop in munitions and an increasing inability to evacuate the wounded. In Berlin, the Führer bunker already functioned as a command center isolated from the front. Hitler, who had not visited it since November, issued direct orders about units that existed only on maps. On the 9th of January, he dictated the 11th Directive for the East, ordering to hold all positions at any cost. The Chief of the General Staff, Heinz Guderian, warned that the Vistula line could not be held. His handwritten notes indicated the lack of fuel, vehicles, and replacement personnel. On January 12th, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive began. In just 2 days, Zhukov and Konev's forces broke the front at several points, especially near Barano and Sandomierz. The German divisions, weakened by the scarcity of resources, disbanded in the field. The OKH reports recorded the loss of contact with more than 20 divisions between January 13th and 16th. Transmissions intercepted by the Western Command described units reduced to groups of a few hundred men without artillery or air support. The material deterioration reached all levels. On January 15th, General Wilhelm Burgdorf reported that almost half of the Panzer IV tanks remained immobilized due to lack of spare parts. The fuel depots in Silesia were under constant bombardment, and the supply trains were saturated by the evacuation of civilians. Despite the evidence, Hitler rejected any proposal to withdraw to the Oder and expressly prohibited elastic defense. The rigidity of command reflected the isolation of the central power. Keitel and Jodl, at the head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, transmitted the Führer's orders without alteration. In the meetings on the 17th and 18th of January, Guderian insisted on withdrawing the forces to protect Berlin and Silesia, but Hitler refused. His watchword, repeated in the day's communiques, was that the enemy must be stopped at the Vistula, or would never be stopped. The consequence was the destruction of Army Group A. Between the 14th and the 19th of January, the Soviet fronts advanced more than 100 kilometers daily, surrounding Lodz and Krakow. The German armored divisions abandoned their vehicles due to lack of fuel. Guderian himself described the situation as total collapse. In the north, Army Group Center was trying to hold East Prussia, turned into a fortress. On the 22nd of January, the Soviet offensive on Königsberg began, and 4 days later the region was isolated. Hitler, upon receiving the report, prohibited any evacuation. although Admiral Dönitz independently initiated a maritime operation that managed to transport hundreds of thousands of people to the west. The logistical collapse was already irreversible. The fuel reserves were concentrated far from the front in the Upper Rhine and Bohemia. The Luftwaffe could barely maintain reconnaissance flights. A report from the 25th of January indicated that only a few aircraft took off that day on the entire Eastern Front. The artillery, short of ammunition, used incompatible or captured projectiles. The infantry divisions operated without stable communications or sufficient transport. The Oder line was the last possible defensive position, but the orders to hold the Vistula prevented it from being prepared. When some units began spontaneous withdrawals, they were intercepted by SS patrols or the Feldgendarmerie. The records of the 20th of January document summary executions of officers accused of abandoning their posts. Since the end of the previous year, the flying courts created by Himmler had been authorized to apply immediate sentences. The consequence was the disintegration of the internal cohesion of the army. On January 25th, Hitler issued Directive No. 12, declaring Berlin the supreme fortress of the Reich and ordering its preparation for urban combat, even though the capital was still far from the front. The measure symbolized the loss of all operational vision. Guderian himself noted that day that the Führer intended to command armies that no longer existed. The reports from the last days of January showed figures that illustrated the collapse. More than 500,000 losses in 3 weeks, the loss of thousands of armored vehicles, and the breakdown of communications with all units east of the Oder. The Soviet forces had advanced more than 300 kilometers. On the 31st of January, the vanguards of the First Belarusian Front reached the western bank of the Oder, across from Kustrin, a short distance from Berlin. Inside the German command, the difference between the actual reports and the ones delivered to Hitler became abysmal. Keitel and Jodl drafted parallel versions of the reports, replacing terms like retreat with euphemistic expressions. The preserved documents show this growing duplicity, a language of formal optimism in contrast to the evidence of collapse. On January 30th, on the anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler delivered a radio speech from the Chancellery, written by Goebbels, in which he claimed that the spirit of the Eastern Front remained intact. Meanwhile, Soviet forces occupied Lodz and advanced through West Prussia. The distance between official rhetoric and reality was absolute. By the end of the month, the German army had lost all maneuverability. The last armored reserves were concentrated around Berlin and Silesia. Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, at the head of Army Group Center, maintained relentless discipline, ordering executions of officers for unauthorized withdrawal. Radio communications were irregular, links with intermediate commands were continuously broken, and coordination between army corps was already non-existent. The Wehrmacht had ceased to function as a unified structure. Isolated formations fought on local initiative without mutual support or central control. On the 31st of January, the General Staff reported that the Red Army had crossed the Oder at several points, establishing bridgeheads in front of which the German defenses lacked fortifications and engineering materials. In many sectors, soldiers dug trenches with civilian tools. The moral collapse accompanied the material. The orders demanded resistance without conditions, but the units dissolved during the night retreats. The companies disappeared without leaving a record. The soldiers surrendered or dispersed. The SS sent punitive detachments to impose discipline through public executions. In that climate, the command lost all capacity for effective direction. Despite the evidence, Hitler still believed a counter-offensive was possible. In a meeting with Keitel and Jodl, he ordered a concentration of forces in the Kustrin sector for a pincer strike against the Soviet flank. Guderian explained that there was not even fuel to move the tanks. The order was given, but no movement was executed. The military system of the Reich had been reduced to an administrative structure that produced orders without effect. The OKW transmitted directives that no one could fulfill. The OKH lacked control over its formations. Communications with the front were fragmentary. Reports arrived days late or not at all. The bureaucratic machinery continued to function as if the front existed. Although on the ground, there were only scattered remnants of exhausted troops. Between the 1st of February and the 31st of March of 1945, the Eastern Front of the Third Reich operated under a rigid principle: hold each position, even when its defense meant the complete destruction of the units. The orders issued from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and the Oberkommando des Heeres restricted the initiative of the subordinate commands. Maneuver, the traditional basis of German tactics, was replaced by immobility. The directive to remain on the ground, imposed from the summit, transformed the front into a succession of isolated positions, vulnerable to penetration and encirclement. In Pomerania, the German device relied on the Pommernstellung, an incomplete line with unfinished fortifications and scattered logistical depots. The 3rd Panzer Army, assigned to the newly formed Army Group Vistula, was to cover the corridor between the Baltic and the Oder Valley to prevent an encirclement from the north. In mid-February, the orders reiterated the prohibition against yielding ground, even in the face of evidence of lateral ruptures. Reconnaissance units reported Soviet armored concentrations on secondary roads, but local commanders were not authorized to retreat. Between the 10th and the 12th of February, several German brigades were at an angle with respect to their neighbors, with exposed flanks. The sequence that was repeated along the front was constant: breakthrough in an adjacent sector, loss of radio link, instruction to hold until further orders, depletion of ammunition, request for withdrawal, refusal from the higher level, and finally encirclement closure. In less than 2 days, positions that could have been withdrawn in an orderly manner became pockets with no escape. An example occurred on the western salient of Köslin. An infantry division received on the 14th of February the order to remain in its position, although the enemy had broken through to the south. The commander requested to shorten the line to rely on watercourses, but the Corps command denied the movement, invoking the need to buy time. The promised reinforcements never arrived. In 2 days, the division was surrounded. The night attempt to break the encirclement failed due to lack of fuel and Soviet fire control over the routes. At 48 hours, the unit disappeared from operational records. Its remnants were regrouped into smaller formations. In Silesia, the Army Group Center, subjected to an equally rigid command, resisted Soviet attacks in Upper and Lower Silesia without applying staggered retreat maneuvers. The aim was to preserve industrial access routes and lateral communications, but the correlation of forces was unsustainable. Losses exceeded replacements and the transport fleet reduced every week. The defensive rings surrounding the cities declared as fortresses absorbed infantry and artillery troops that could no longer be used as reserves. When those cities became encircled, the High Command attempted to maintain supply corridors that consumed resources impossible to replenish. The result was a double loss: immobilization of valuable troops and weakening of the open sectors. In February, the possibility of retreating the front towards the Oder was discussed within the OKH. Some commands defended elasticity and the concentration of reserves behind the river. The final decision maintained the opposite guideline: resist every meter and create friction to the attacker even at the price of encirclement. Several commanders who proposed local withdrawals were dismissed. These removals affected the continuity of command, causing interruptions in the orders and counter-orders that reintroduced units into newly evacuated positions. At the end of February, the command ordered a limited counterattack in Pomerania. The operation was carried out without the concentration of forces or the necessary logistical support. The prohibition of abandoning secondary positions prevented the gathering of sufficient units. The movements lacked synchronization, and the exhaustion of fuel reduced the duration of the offensive. Once the momentum ceased, the units were ordered to entrench themselves where they were. Immobility under fire repeated the pattern of isolation and destruction. In 3 days, the forward sectors were absorbed by the Soviet advance. On the Oder, the situation stemming from January consolidated into Soviet bridgeheads facing Kustrin and other points. The doctrine of no retreat kept garrisons in river bends exposed to being cut off. German engineers tried to maintain the crossings under constant fire with scarce bridging materials. The attrition in this sector was continuous, During those months, the designation of fortress became a widespread operational category. Cities and railway hubs were declared positions to be held at any cost. In Pomerania, several ports were given this status. In Silesia, key urban centers were fortified. The enemy avoided many of these fortresses, encircling them and continuing their advance. The garrisons were immobilized without the ability to maneuver. The order to hold them prevented their use as reserves, and the enclosed forces ended up being extinguished without altering the general course of the Soviet offensive. The correspondence of the High Command documents numerous dismissals for unauthorized withdrawal. Officers who reported the impossibility of holding a position were immediately relieved. The mechanism was simple: superior report, summary opening of case, and dismissal. These procedures produced a climate of literal obedience in which tactical interpretation disappeared. In East Prussia, the pockets formed in January continued to diminish. The Heiligenbeil pocket on the shore of the Frisches Haff concentrated troops trying to maintain a corridor to the port of Pillau. Higher orders insisted on keeping the bridgeheads while maritime evacuations were organized. In practice, the maintenance of these bulges consumed resources without operational benefit. Heavy artillery pieces were abandoned as the fuel to tow them was exhausted, and the retreat routes were constantly pounded. By mid-March, the surviving units barely represented a fraction of their theoretical strength. In Courland, the army group encircled since the previous autumn remained stationary. It did not receive authorization to break southwards, nor to evacuate its forces. In the context of the war without withdrawal, Courland symbolized total immobility. Experienced divisions remained outside the main theater, with no operational utility for the defense of the Reich. In March, the German command began preparing staggered defense lines on the eastern plain of Berlin. They were trying to introduce criteria of economy of forces and terrain selection, although the orders not to yield were still in effect. The forward units, including those located in Soviet bridgeheads, could not disengage without higher authorization. The construction of secondary positions represented a belated effort, limited by the lack of mobile reserves and fortification materials. The deterioration of communications exacerbated the problem. Radio networks suffered from interference, equipment losses were constant, and motorized messengers could barely circulate due to the lack of fuel. Orders arrived late, and many units acted according to outdated guidelines. Coordination between Army Corps weakened until it became nominal. The logistical balance was definitively broken. The bombings on railways and roads reduced the flow of supplies. The priority given to ammunition and fuel was not enough to sustain the minimum consumption. Although the winter was less severe than the previous one, the mud and ice made movement difficult. The German artillery reduced its rate to conserve shells, which facilitated the Soviet preparations. In the second half of March, the Soviet offensive on eastern Pomerania advanced towards Danzig and Gdynia. The orders to hold fortresses created an irregular front, with fortified urban centers and extensive rural sectors without solid defense. The enemy concentrated their attacks on the weak areas, avoiding the more resistant points until these were isolated. The attempts to open land corridors to the ports were late and lacked resources. The garrisons, immobilized by the orders to remain, were doomed to encirclement. In Silesia, the defensive rings formed around bridges and accesses over the Oder followed the same logic. Some were well built and equipped with coordinated artillery. Others improvised with remnants of units. In both cases, the lack of mobility prevented taking advantage of partial successes. After repelling attacks, the troops could not withdraw to subsequent lines due to lack of authorization. Throughout the entire month of March, the same cycle repeated: defense in position, depletion of ammunition, reduction of personnel, loss of communication, and final encirclement. Reinforcements barely covered a part of the casualties, and the replacements that arrived were integrated into disorganized formations. The ability to take initiative was extinguished. Remaining by higher order replaced the judgment of local commanders. The adversary, free to adjust its pace, maintained uninterrupted pressure. The nominal reserves were incomplete formations, remnants of divisions, training battalions, or improvised groups without transportation or artillery. There were no forces capable of executing coordinated counterattacks. In the Oder sector, small tactical corrections were attempted, slightly withdrawing some sectors to improve firing fields. These local maneuvers represented a limited shift in approach, aimed at buying time rather than regaining the initiative. The effects were few. The Soviet bridgeheads were consolidated, and the German attempts to reduce them failed due to lack of concentration and support. In East Prussia and in Pomerania, the final contractions of the device confirmed the loss of control. The sea evacuation continued, but the transport capacity was insufficient. In the end of March reports, several divisions existed only as administrative designations, integrated into battalion-sized groups. At the end of March of 1945, the no-withdrawal policy had left a rigid front, pierced by multiple penetrations, turned into successive encirclements. The obstinacy in holding the ground had reduced the combat potential intended for the defense of the Oder and the capital. The war without withdrawal resulted in the immobility of an army that continued to receive orders impossible to fulfill, while the enemy advanced towards the heart of the Reich. During March of 1945, the Western Front of the Third Reich reached its terminal phase. The Rhine River, considered the last natural barrier before the country's industrial core, was to become the definitive line of defense according to the orders of the Oberbefehlshaber West. However, that defense never materialized as a coherent system. The sectors were held in isolation, without maneuver reserves, without coordination between the armies, and with a logistics network destroyed by the Allied bombings. Internal documents from the Western Command describe incomplete divisions, headquarters without operational personnel, and formations dependent on improvised transport. At the beginning of March, the Supreme Command in the West passed to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who replaced Gerd von Rundstedt on the 10th of that month by direct decision of Hitler. Kesselring, with experience in the defense of Italy, received the task of holding the Rhine at all costs and protecting the Ruhr Basin. The directive of the 11th of March formulated that order in absolute terms: no retreat, no evacuation. The material circumstances contradicted the slogan. The divisions lacked fuel, the vehicles were immobilized, and the artillery was reduced by the losses and by the transfer of pieces to the Eastern Front. On March 7th, the 9th United States Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge in Remagen intact. The explosive charge intended for its demolition was not activated in time. Within a few hours, the first Allied battalions crossed to the eastern bank of the Rhine. The local German command, attached to the 5th Panzer Army, reported the incident with a delay. When the news reached the OKW, Hitler reacted by ordering immediate executions among those responsible and dismissed the commanders of the sector. The measure did not alter the tactical situation. The enemy had established a bridgehead that would be expanded without effective opposition. The Remagen case illustrated the gap between the intention of total resistance and the actual defense capability. The records of OB West show that the forces available to contain the penetration were insufficient. The units of the 15th Army, mostly comprised of Volksgrenadier and hurried replacements, lacked mobility. The counterattacks carried out between the 8th and 12th of March exhausted their scarce fuel before reaching the assembly areas. The panzer divisions designated as reserve, the 6th and the 11th, had less than half of their operational tanks and no spare parts. In less than 1 week, the enemy consolidated a stable logistical bridge over the Rhine. Throughout the month, new crossing operations took place in different sectors. In the north, between Wesel and Ries, the 21st British Army Group executed a planned crossing with massive artillery support and total air dominance. In the south, Patton's Third Army crossed the river between Oppenheim and Worms without organized resistance. The Rhine line crumbled in all sections. The defenses built the previous year were incomplete or unoccupied. Much of the heavy material had been transferred to the east following the OKW's instructions, which continued to consider containment of the Red Army a priority. The loss of the Rhine opened direct access to the Ruhr. In that region, about 300,000 people were concentrated in the 5th Panzer Army and the 15th Army under the command of General Walter Model, head of Army Group B. From Berlin, Hitler issued a directive on the 19th of March, ordering to defend the industrial basin to the last man. In the same days, he promulgated the so-called Nero Befehl, which required the destruction of infrastructures to prevent their use by the enemy. Model, aware of the Ruhr's value for the civilian population and the remaining industry, attempted to maintain the cohesion of his forces within the imposed limits. The immediate consequence was the creation of a closed space with no operational exit. On the 24th of March, the Allied armies crossed the Rhine at various points and advanced north and east. The German units lacked fuel and could not maneuver. The roads were saturated with refugees and remnants of scattered units. The ordered counterattacks were reduced to local actions that died out before forming. The motorized columns were attacked by Allied aviation even before reaching their objectives. The Luftwaffe, without aircraft or fuel, could not intervene. On March 26th, Army Group B informed OB West that it could not hold the Lippe River line. Ammunition stocks would be reduced to 1/5 in 2 days. Kesselring requested authorization to retreat towards the Weser and reorganize the defense. From Berlin came the negative response. The directive of March 27th ordered to resist unconditionally, stating that the forces must hold out by their own determination. That instruction was equivalent to the nullification of any tactical leeway. The operation journals reflect the disintegration phase. The panzer divisions, without fuel, buried their tanks to use them as fixed artillery. The infantry divisions tried to close the gaps without lateral support. Without motorized reserves, the flanks were left open. In the records of the 12th Army Corps, the enemy's advance towards Hamm and Paderborn is described as almost without organized opposition. The German combat groups, reduced to a few hundred men, moved without knowledge of the rest of the apparatus. On the 1st of April, the American armies closed the encirclement around the Ruhr. Internal communications collapsed. The trapped units lacked fuel, food, and ammunition. Model ordered the organization of a defense in depth within the encirclement, hoping for a relief operation from the Weser that would never occur. In reality, the divisions no longer responded to centralized orders. They became isolated nuclei of urban or rural resistance. The reports of material losses from the first days of April show the destruction or abandonment of more than 1,000 armored vehicles and the almost total loss of field artillery. Radio communications were intermittent and the orders ineffective. The Allied forces divided the encirclement into smaller sectors, further fragmenting the defenses. The German groups still fighting improvised resupply with captured material, but the enemy's air superiority nullified any attempt at reorganization. In Berlin, the political leadership reacted with slogans of symbolic resistance. Hitler demanded to turn the defense of the Ruhr into a demonstration of the Reich's will. On the 4th of April, the OKW reiterated the order to hold the position and destroy the industrial facilities before their fall. In practice, the troops lacked the means to execute those demolitions. Most of the factories and mines were captured intact or with limited damage. Inside the enclosure, the disorder intensified. The administrative units disappeared, and the middle ranks lost contact with their subordinates. The combat formations, without lateral links or supply, depended on local depots or improvisation. The attempts by Model to coordinate a breakout towards the east were frustrated by the lack of fuel and the inexistence of vehicles. In several sectors, the commanders decided to divide their forces into small groups to try to escape individually. The breakdown of communications prevented the OB West from accurately assessing the situation. The reports reaching Kesselring were incomplete and several days late. On April 9th, the Allied armies divided the encirclement into 2 pockets, north and south, making any coordination impossible. In the Western Command documents, it was acknowledged that Army Group B had ceased to exist as an operational structure, although it still appeared in the organizational charts. As the encirclement tightened, the German divisions disbanded. The tanks without fuel were destroyed by their own crews. The artillery ammunition was exhausted, and the pieces were rendered unusable. The attempts at concentration for a nighttime breakout failed due to lack of coordination and total air control by the enemy. Allied reports record massive surrenders. The prisoners, in many cases, presented themselves in whole groups without having fought. Between the 1st and the 15th of April, the captures exceeded 300,000 people, including complete infantry and armored units. The surrendered troops were largely replacement formations, but among the prisoners there were also veteran officers and non-commissioned officers. The improvised prisoner camps on the western bank of the Rhine showed the magnitude of the collapse, an army destroyed not so much by battle as by the loss of cohesion and resources. After the fall of the Ruhr, the structure of OB West no longer had operational meaning. Kesselring attempted to establish a defensive line at the Weser and the Harz, but the remaining forces barely exceeded a few thousand scattered men. Reports from mid-April described divisions reduced to hundreds of combatants, without artillery or transport. The orders to establish a new line were nominal. The troops simply retreated while the enemy advanced without serious resistance. The defense of the Rhine had failed at all levels. The Central Command clung to the rhetoric of total resistance, while the realities on the ground showed a dissolved front. The doctrine of no retreat, applied also in the West, produced the same effect as on the Eastern Front: immobile sectors, successive encirclements, and total loss of maneuverability. In the reports of the 15th of April, OB West described the situation as a set of isolated pockets, without continuity or central command, a military structure reduced to fragments that still bore the names of armies, but that in effect had ceased to exist. Between February and April of 1945, the conduct of the war within the Reich adopted a coercive structure that replaced maneuver with obligation. The resulting system integrated the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht with SS and party organs, endowed with the authority to impose total resistance through disciplinary orders, summary courts, and political control. This architecture functioned on two levels. At the upper level, strategic management maintained the prohibition of withdrawals and the defense of positions declared fortresses. At the lower level, a network of commissioners and security forces ensured the immediate execution of orders through exemplary sanctions. The total resistance directives, reiterated from the OKW, defined that no commander could yield ground without express authorization, that any position designated as a fortress had to be maintained, and that any unauthorized withdrawal constituted a military offense. The transmission of these orders was carried out by the party structures, the SS, and the military districts, creating a circuit in which obedience had a penal character. Simultaneously, the figure of the Reich Defense Commissioner or plenipotentiary was formalized, with powers over entire regions. These commissioners, dependent on the supreme leadership, coordinated civil resources, Volkssturm, and regular units, with authority over local military and political commands. Its function extended to three areas: local defense, movement control, and discipline. In the first, they organized and supervised the mobilization of the Volkssturm, ensuring their permanence at the designated points. In the second, they controlled the transit, blocked roads and railway junctions, and prevented unauthorized retreats. In the third, they applied immediate sanctions for disobedience or abandonment of position through field courts or direct intervention by the SS. This overlap of attributions created a dual chain of command in each district. One military, dependent on the Wehrmacht, and another coercive, linked to the party and the SS, supported by the OKW regarding the legal validity of disciplinary measures. The commissars relied on a dual structure. Each region had an office of Reich Defense with political leadership and a delegation of the SS and the police. In case of conflict with commands of the Wehrmacht, the rule established the priority of total resistance orders over any tactical argument. In practice, any proposal for withdrawal had to have political approval. Delay in the response or formal refusal eliminated the room for maneuver. This device was added to the expedited justice system. Since the end of 1944, there were mobile courts with the ability to meet on the road and issue immediate sentences. Between February and April of the following year, their activity increased. Unauthorized withdrawal, loss of weapon, disobedience, or lack of fighting spirit were classified as crimes. The procedure began with a report from a superior or an arrest by the Feldgendarmerie or SS. The instruction was minimal. The defendant's statement, the chief's report, and the verification of the unfulfilled order were all that was needed to issue a sentence. The campaign courts in the rear complemented this mechanism. Their composition included a presiding officer, a clerk, and occasionally a legal advisor. The sanctions ranged from demotions to the death penalty. Executions were carried out immediately and recorded in disciplinary bulletins distributed to nearby units for exemplary purposes. The verifications were limited, as fragmented communications and frequent rotations made it difficult to verify the facts. The main effect was to consolidate the perception that any retreat was equivalent to a punishable offense. The Feldgendarmerie acted as an instrument of this system. Its patrols controlled roads, intersections, and stations, stopping individuals or groups without movement documentation. Those who could not show written orders of withdrawal were put at the disposal of the nearest tribunal. In coordination with the SS, mixed teams were organized to inspect routes, marching formations, and transit areas. Disciplinary records were centralized by region and forwarded to the higher level, establishing a bureaucratic chain of control that covered the entire interior territory. The pressure from the courts changed the behavior of middle management. Orders were duplicated, delivered with acknowledgement of receipt, and filed as proof of compliance. Any withdrawal required written justification and subsequent authorization. The preference to avoid penalties increased the permanence in untenable positions and reduced initiative. The need for traceability slowed down tactical response. On the battlefield, the delay translated into irrecoverable losses. To the judicial structure was added the direct intervention of the SS in the execution of military orders. In sectors where the Wehrmacht attempted to reorganize lines, SS units were given the mandate to ensure discipline. They established checkpoints, inspected columns, separated those who lacked valid orders and returned them to the front or referred them to tribunals. Occasionally, local SS headquarters issued counter-orders to army commands, preventing planned retreat movements. Furthermore, they assumed control of local defense, integrating the Volkssturm under their own authority, independent of the tactical assessments of the regular army. The Volkssturm, composed of men of diverse ages and experience, became a tool for territorial control. Their orders established the obligation to maintain designated points and to inform the SS of any movement of regular units that implied retreat. In numerous areas, their detachments were positioned behind the combat lines as administrative barriers. Their effectiveness in combat was limited, but their disciplinary function considerable. The SS extended their authority to resource management. They could requisition vehicles, fuel, and communication equipment for control tasks. These requisitions interfered with military logistics, reducing the mobility of operational units. The priority given to patrols and commissioners over tactical needs caused cases where the forces assigned to counterattacks lacked fuel because it had been reassigned to blocking missions. The contradiction between fighting and controlling movement was invariably resolved in favor of control. The dual command was institutionalized. In each military district, the headquarters of the Wehrkreis managed replacements and depots, while the SS headquarters and the regional commissioner's office ensured the implementation of resistance directives. If a division commander intended to pull back to shorten his line, he had to obtain political approval, which delayed the action. In numerous cases, the lack of response nullified the tactical opportunity. The disciplinary bulletins of February and March listed the punishable behaviors and their penalties. They circulated through units, depots, and field hospitals, setting a standard of absolute compliance. The sanctions were graded in 3 levels: demotion, penal labor, or execution. The punishment units were used in high-risk tasks such as demining or advanced defense. The existence of this legal framework created an environment where literal obedience replaced military judgment. The system directly affected company and battalion commanders. Fearful of sanctions, They requested written instructions for any decision. The multiplication of consultations slowed down the reaction. Saturated communications and the loss of links aggravated the uncertainty. At times, the commanders were left in a vacuum of authority without order confirmation, but equally subject to criminal liability. The militarization extended to the civil administration. Mayors and local leaders had to collaborate in the recruitment of the Volkssturm, provide accommodation to patrols and report absences. In several regions, they were entrusted with organizing resistance points with mixed personnel, assuming direct responsibility over their maintenance. This network of commands and commissioners turned the interior of the country into a mesh of rigid positions that hindered any general maneuver. The tensions with the Wehrmacht were constant. When a commander tried to regroup forces by withdrawing local garrisons, he needed authorization from the political authority. The refusal to release these garrisons reduced the ability to concentrate and left wide areas defended by personnel without mobility. Consequently, enemy penetrations encountered little organized resistance. Coercive control reached communications and transportation. SS commissioners and headquarters installed priority radios capable of intercepting messages and issuing alerts about unauthorized movements. At stations and crossings, marching orders and destination stamps were reviewed. Transit without documentation led to arrests. Ammunition and supply trains were inspected to confirm their destination to positions considered essential. This control absorbed logistical means and reduced operational flexibility. At the aerodromes, the political authorities extended their control over connecting and transport flights. Part of the remaining aviation was allocated to administrative missions, reducing reconnaissance capability. The land communication networks, saturated with disciplinary reports, lost effectiveness. An order for local withdrawal had to go through multiple offices before being executed, turning the tactical response into an administrative process. The exceptional regulations expanded their scope during these months. Any withdrawal was considered a global detriment, prohibited unless authorized by a superior. This conception shifted the success criterion from the operational outcome to formal compliance. A commander who maintained his position until exhaustion complied with the rule. One who preserved it by retreating without order was at fault. The discipline manuals distributed in March insisted on obedience without interpretation. Local analysis was declared irrelevant in the face of superior instruction. The operational impact of this system was measurable. In cohesion, it maintained units in positions until their complete destruction, increasing losses without altering the general course. In mobility, it immobilized resources and personnel in control tasks. In coordination, it multiplied counterorders and delays. Replacements sent to depleted units entered into a framework where the only directive was to remain. Companies without the possibility of relief continued on the line until their disappearance. Discipline was reinforced with mandatory readings of summary judgments to the troops. These sessions were recorded in minutes and sought to unify the criterion that any retreat equaled disobedience. The same instructions were extended to hospitals and recovery centers. At the same time, the party ordered local authorities to report signs of disintegration or desertion, crossing that data with reports from the Feldgendarmerie to generate risk maps. In the areas with the highest incidences, the presence of patrols and commissioners was increased. The military districts responsible for recruitment and equipping aligned with the directives of permanence. Courses were accelerated, standards were reduced, and shipments to strongholds were prioritized. The shortage of transportation and fuel limited movements, and health headquarters restricted evacuations to avoid obstructing the routes. The insufficient weaponry was concentrated in urban defenses, leaving rural sectors with obsolete or heterogeneous material. The lack of radio and batteries forced the use of messengers, with the consequent delay in orders. The militarization of the Reich during the last months of the war constituted a system of coercive administration of the defeat. Its effectiveness was measured by obedience, not by the tactical outcome. The apparatus made up of Kommissars, courts, Feldgendarmerie, SS, and Volkssturm upheld the principle of absolute resistance even when material reality made it unfeasible. Military initiative was subordinated to the literal execution of the higher order, and discipline became a substitute for strategy. The defense of Berlin represented the most concentrated form of the military collapse of the Reich, a structure conceived for metropolitan combat that operated without means, with fragmented commands and disintegrated communications. The device did not respond to a global strategy, but to the need to manage the defeat within the limits of the capital. The initial organization was based on a classic tactical principle, defense by sectors, adapted to an urban environment that was already in ruins. Berlin was divided into zones with a single command post and regiment and battalion links. Under this structure, remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS units, police, Volkssturm, and foreign contingents from shattered fronts were mixed. Doctrinal homogeneity disappeared. Veteran fighters, untrained militiamen, and ideological forces under different commands coexisted. The operational objective was to preserve the administrative core as long as possible, delay the enemy's access to the bridges of the Spree, and maintain the image of a capital in resistance. Unlike previous battles, urban defense was not conceived as a maneuver, but as a fixed device. It was structured in concentric rings, periphery, railway belt, and government center, that were intended to absorb the pressure through successive delays. Engineers improvised obstacles with overturned trams, rubble, and anti-tank ditches, but the density of enemy fire reduced the tactical value of these lines. The command of the square, under the charge of Artillery General Helmut Weidling, had to coordinate forces of different origin and hierarchy. Its control became progressively nominal. The eastern sectors, where the main offensive was concentrated, were soon cut off from the center. Telephone links collapsed, and radios were insufficient. Orders were transmitted by messengers subjected to constant fire. Decisions arrived late or contradicted each other. The command structure, based on sectorization, lost its functional cohesion and turned into a mosaic of autonomous commands. The principle of tactical unity faded. In many sectors, contradictory orders coexisted, to hold on to every block or to concentrate defense on main strongpoints. Military discipline gave way to local initiative. Some commanders prioritized the survival of their men, others executed impossible directives literally. The rigidity of the system, prohibition of withdrawal, defense at all costs, transformed tactics into immobility. On the material level, the defense lacked the three elements that support effective urban combat: mobile reserves, sufficient ammunition, and stable communications. The artillery was immobilized due to lack of fuel. The anti-tank guns were used as fixed cannons. The ammunition was managed on a building-by-building basis. Reserves no longer existed. Each sector used its last forces to cover immediate gaps. The ability to maneuver disappeared, as did the possibility of counterattack or reorganization. The bridges over the Spree and the Landwehr Canal constituted the defensive axis. They were the only structures with real tactical value. Controlling a crossing meant maintaining lateral communication between sectors. Their defense absorbed the last resources. Anti-tank guns and sappers were concentrated, adjacent buildings were fortified, and crossfires were established. The result was combat over minimal distances, with systematic destruction of positions by direct artillery fire. Each bridge represented a delay point that, once lost, accentuated the isolation of neighboring sectors. The heterogeneity of forces was another structural feature. The Wehrmacht applied conventional criteria of defense in depth. The SS units maintained a model of close resistance, and the Volkssturm acted as a covering force. In theory, these functions were complementary. In practice, they overlapped. The SS units operated autonomously, the Volkssturm depended on local leaders, and the army officers tried to maintain discipline over fighters who did not recognize their authority. That overlap of command chains nullified doctrinal coherence. Weidling's command attempted to centralize control by issuing priority directives: bridges, crossings, and solid structure buildings, But the available information was incomplete. The orders reached areas where the situation had changed. The flow of one-way messages replaced effective communication. The battle turned into a sum of static defenses with no temporal or spatial coordination. At the tactical level, the fight was reduced to the scale of buildings. The density of fire and the destruction of the terrain prevented maneuvers. The combat groups, composed of an anti-tank piece, machine guns and riflemen, defended floors and basements. The alternation between demolition by artillery and assault by infantry defined the typical sequence of combat. The city became a set of isolated strongpoints. The use of urban terrain as a defensive element had limited effectiveness. Massive constructions, ministries, stations, large residential blocks offered temporary resistance, but the use of direct artillery and concentrated charges nullified their structural value. The enemy advanced building by building, reducing each point through methodical fire. The German defense responded with short-range fire and minimal counterattacks, sustained by physical proximity rather than command. The organization of the interior space of the administrative center, known as Citadel, synthesized the final model of defense. The area became a closed system of barricades, firing positions in corridors, and controlled access points. The last forces of the Wehrmacht and the SS converged there. The combat took place in confined spaces, with the use of short weapons and grenades. The lack of ammunition and personnel reduced the resistance to a matter of hours. The Volkssturm played a marginal but significant role. It served as a delaying and liaison force, filling gaps between regular units and maintaining the appearance of control in already disintegrated sectors. Its main function was to sustain the physical continuity of the defense while professional units concentrated on key points. From the operational point of view, the defense of Berlin was not a classic battle but a process of attrition. Its dynamics were based on three mechanisms: territorial fragmentation, progressive isolation, and the replacement of maneuver with persistence. The initial planning was maintained only in the documents. On the ground, improvisation prevailed. Between mid and late April of 1945, the German military leadership was reduced to the Führerbunker, an underground complex turned into an isolated command center. Orders continued to be issued from there as if coherent fronts existed, even though the corresponding formations had been destroyed or dispersed. Operational information arrived fragmented, and the situation maps maintained symbols of armies that only existed on paper. The decision-making process followed a rigid scheme. The Führer dictated instructions, the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW, drafted them. They were logged with an order number and transmitted. The circuit was formally completed, but without control over the outcome. Return reports were partial or fictitious, and the political leadership interpreted any communication of impossibility as disobedience. The conferences in the bunker were held each day, with Hitler at the head of a situation table. Liaison officers presented concise reports that omitted negative data. The dynamic consisted of maintaining the appearance of functional command. The diaries of Keitel and Jodl describe meetings where administrative details, numbering of orders, dates and signatures, were discussed without operational content. The orders from the 18th to the 25th of April included counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed. The distance between military reality and official representation became the norm. The situation maps showed the 9th Army in motion when it had been encircled in Halbe, and the Vistula Army Group as an offensive force when it lacked means. The Führerbunker thus operated as a broadcasting office without verification, sustained by bureaucratic inertia and the will to maintain formal authority. Starting from the 23rd of April, the crisis of confidence reached the top. Hermann Göring, nominal head of the Luftwaffe, sent an encrypted message from Obersalzberg, invoking the clause that designated him as successor in case of the Führer's incapacity. In the bunker, the telegram was considered a coup attempt. Goebbels and Bormann presented the text to Hitler, who ordered his dismissal and arrest. Keitel signed the resolution. The Luftwaffe was no longer an operational force, but the episode revealed the definitive breakdown of loyalties. A few days later, a similar conflict occurred with Himmler. From Lübeck, he tried to negotiate with the Western Allies through Swedish envoys. The talks began around the 21st of April and intensified after the 25th. When the news reached the Führerbunker on the 28th, Hitler reacted with a new order of dismissal and arrest. By then, Himmler had lost control of his units, scattered or subordinate to the command of the army. The measure was symbolic. The central leadership could no longer execute its own directives. In that same period, the Ministry of Propaganda continued issuing war bulletins with language identical to that of previous months. There was talk of steadfast defenses and successful counterattacks when the capital was encircled. Broadcasts occurred as a routine. Writers prepared statements, presenters read them, and stations transmitted them until the lines were interrupted. The information apparatus maintained the liturgy of a still operational state, while its material structure disappeared. Inside the bunker, the work rhythm remained methodical. The officers recorded every order with number, stamp, and signature. External communications were reduced to shortwave radios and messengers that took hours or days to return. The information accumulated in folders without compliance verification. Negative messages were deferred or omitted, which generated a partial and outdated version of the war. Hitler preserved the format of the conferences, but without debate. Decisions were made immediately and transcribed into documents that no one could execute. Keitel and Jodl acted as automatic transmitters. They reproduced the instructions and signed without discussing their viability. The real command had extinguished, but the administrative structure remained. In the last days of April, the OKW documentation shows movement orders for non-existent army corps and designations of commanders without troops. The organization charts were updated with units of minimum staffing, sometimes of only 100 men, kept on the lists to maintain the appearance of continuity. The command system had transformed from a military instrument to a ritual mechanism. The Führerbunker functioned simultaneously as a political headquarters and a military office. The goal was to prolong the idea of a government center. Communications with the outside were scarce. Incoming information was filtered to avoid extreme reactions. The result was a closed circle where decisions were no longer confronted with reality. The dismissals of Goering and Himmler illustrated the loss of personal control. Other generals were accused of disobedience simply for proposing withdrawals or contacts with the enemy. Autonomous initiatives were interpreted as sabotage. In that atmosphere, the OKW ceased to be a coordinating body to become a transmitter of the Führer's rhetoric, resistance without surrender and absolute compliance. The diaries of the officers present describe an atmosphere of extreme formality and silence. The orders were written with technical precision, but their execution was non-existent. Authority had transformed into ceremony. The Führer continued signing documents until the 30th of April, when the outer sectors of Berlin had already fallen. That day, defense directives were still issued that had no operational recipients. The last feature of the system was its language. The final statements retained expressions like firm positions or fronts in reorganization. None corresponded to the facts, but they were repeated to maintain the fiction of control. The distance between word and reality defined the nature of command in its final hours, an active administrative structure over an operational void. Between the last days of April and the 8th of May of 1945, the German defeat resulted in a series of partial capitulations signed by commanders acting autonomously. There was no single surrender. The army dissolved by sectors. The formal power passed to a provisional cabinet in the north of the country, headed by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who tried to coordinate the end of operations through separate agreements with the Allies. On the Western Front, communications were disrupted and formations were retreating uncontrollably. By the end of April, local commanders began direct contact with the enemy. The first documented was that of General Hermann Niehoff, who signed the capitulation of Breslau on the 6th of May after a prolonged siege. Earlier, on the 29th of April, German forces in Italy, under the command of Heinrich von Vietinghoff, had agreed in Caserta to their surrender to Marshal Alexander. The document, effective on the 2nd of May, covered all troops north of Florence and marked the first coordinated cessation of hostilities in an entire theatre. In the north of Germany, the Baltic Sea concentrated the remnants of land and naval units coming from Denmark and Norway. On the 1st of May, one day after Hitler's death, Dönitz assumed the head of the state in accordance with the political testament that named him successor. He established his headquarters in Flensburg, near the Danish border, with a small group of officers, Alfred Jodl in command of operations, and Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, responsible for the navy. From there, he attempted to secure the evacuation to the west and organize an orderly surrender to the Allies. The first formal agreement of that cabinet was the capitulation of the forces in the north of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The conversations held in Lüneburg with the British Marshal Bernard Montgomery concluded on the 4th of May. Von Friedeberg signed the document that stipulated the ceasefire starting from the following day. This act marked the first surrender authorized by the new government and served as a model for the remaining ones. At the same time, in the south and in Bavaria, isolated units were surrendering their weapons without waiting for superior orders. In Austria, the 5th United States Army accepted the surrender of thousands of German soldiers and Allied formations of the Reich. Within a matter of days, forces situated between the Danube and the Alps ceased all resistance. Flensburg then acted as a transmitting office. Dönitz maintained irregular contact with the scattered command posts, but managed to transmit the general order to ceasefire in the areas under Allied control. His administration lacked territorial power, although the Allies effectively recognized it to manage the military transition. On the 5th of May, Dönitz sent Jodl to Eisenhower's headquarters in Rheims with instructions to obtain a limited surrender in the west. Eisenhower rejected any partial surrender and demanded simultaneous acceptance on all fronts. The talks continued through the night of the 6th to the 7th of May. At 2:40 in the morning, Jodl signed the document that set the end of hostilities from the night of the 8th of May. Bedell Smith signed on behalf of the Allied command and General Ivan Susloporov for the Soviet. Dönitz immediately transmitted the order by radio and teleprinter: cease fire on land, sea and air. The instructions were extended to the garrisons in Denmark, Norway and the Netherlands, as well as to the forces in Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia. In the east, where communications were precarious, some sectors continued fighting beyond the scheduled deadline. The Soviet command demanded a second signature at their headquarters in Karlshorst, Berlin, to confirm the validity of the document to the four powers. The ceremony took place in the early morning of the 9th of May, Moscow time. It was signed for Germany by Wilhelm Keitel, von Friedeberg and Hans-Jürgen Stumpf. For the Allies, Georgy Zhukov for the Soviet Union, Arthur Tedder for the United Kingdom, Karl Spaatz for the United States, and Jean de Lattre de Tassigny for France. The text ratified the unconditional surrender of all German forces with effect from the 8th of May, 23 hours and 1 minute Central European time. At that moment, the fronts showed unequal situations. In the north, Denmark and Norway came under British control without resistance. In the west, American and French troops occupied the territory with few incidents. In the south, the formations of the Alps surrendered without combat. In the east, the Red Army continued mopping up operations in Bohemia and the Baltic until the 11th of May, when the last confrontations ceased. During the 8th day, the German broadcasters that still operated disseminated the final order to cease operations. The text instructed all commanders to remain in position and wait for the occupying forces. That order, signed in Flensburg and endorsed by Dönitz, was the last official act of the Wehrmacht as an institution. From that moment, it ceased to exist as a combat force and became prisoner status. The sequence of surrenders unfolded in quick succession: 2nd of May, Italy; 4th, Northern Germany and Denmark; 5th and 6th, Bavaria and Austria; 7th, signing in Reims; 8th, entry into force of the ceasefire; 9th, ratification in Berlin. Starting from the 8th of May, the Allies took full control of communications and military zones. The German command groups were instructed to concentrate in designated areas and surrender weapons and material. In the north, the Navy transferred its ships in British and Danish ports. In the west, the land units surrendered en masse. In the south, the Alpine troops were disarmed by American forces. The government of Flensburg subsisted only 2 weeks more. During that time, it coordinated the repatriation of prisoners, the delivery of material, and the military inventories required by the Allies. On the 23rd of May, Dönitz and his cabinet were arrested by joint decision of the victorious powers. With their detention, the last administrative representation of the Reich ceased, and the fiction of a national command was extinguished.